Can hate actually be addictive? Dr. Pete Simi has interviewed hundreds of extremists, and what he's discovered will change how you think about threats around you. Let's get started.
From the front lines of violence prevention, digging into the details that matter and filtering out the fluff. Get ready for a fast-paced information download that will prepare you to ask the critical question. When disaster strikes, are we good? Now, here's Jim Bennett.
Welcome to Are We Good? Dr. Pete Simi is a professor of sociology at Chapman University. He has spent more than 25 years conducting groundbreaking research on extremist groups and violence, including direct interviews and observations with violent gangs and political extremists. He's a member of Insight, which is the Department of Homeland Security's newest research center focused on terrorism and counterterrorism. He serves as an expert legal consultant on high-profile criminal cases, including testifying in the Portland Max train attack trial. Dr. Simi is co-author of American Swastika: Inside the White Power Movement's Hidden Spaces of Hate and Out of Hiding: Extremist White Supremacy and How It Can Be Stopped, making him one of the nation's leading authorities on understanding and preventing extremist violence. Dr. Simi, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.
Excellent. Great to have you here. Let's dive right into this. So today we're going to really kind of focus on extremism, your specialty, but there's way more than that to talk about with you, but we'll do that in a future episode. But we're going to talk about extremism and that addiction to hate. I think that's a really interesting concept there that we'll explore. So let's kind of give our audience some groundwork here, and that is, if you can kind of tell us how you got started in this field, certainly teaching, but the study of extremist groups.
Well, sure. Yeah, it's for me, my professional kind of career trajectory been deeply kind of informed and influenced by a number of things that happened in early childhood. So I won't go into the detail, it'll be too long, but there, I'll just mention one thing in particular because it was such an early age. When I was 5, which was 1977, the TV miniseries Roots aired for the first time. It was based on the award-winning book by of the same name, and I was 5 years old and I watched it each night, glued to the TV on the linoleum floor there, and it was a very powerful experience. Quite young age to see the really quite graphic display of slavery and really crimes against humanity in many respects that were practiced here in the United States, and deeply informed our country's history and development, and of course things that came after slavery in terms of Jim Crow segregation, and all of this is traced in that week long miniseries. 5, it sensitized me, I think, in many respects. I think, really generated a lot of questions and a need for me to try and understand, these things, how they happened and how they were continuing to influence our society. And so at a pretty young age, I started having questions about things like hatred and where it comes from, and violence and political violence and things of that nature. And so those, a number of other things happened in childhood and adolescence that continued to kind of informed those questions that I had and wanting to understand. And then so when I started graduate school in 1996, it was shortly after the Oklahoma City bombing. And I really wanted to understand, how does a person become a Tim McVeigh, the primary culprit in the Oklahoma City bombing? What led him in his life to decide to do something like bomb the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City and kill, 168 people, including children. And how did he get to that point in his life? And so I decided to start seeing if I could contact members of groups that were similar to what McVeigh had been involved with in terms of anti-government, militia type groups and white supremacist groups, and see if they would allow me to essentially study them and try and learn, from their lives and how they became involved in these types of movements and so forth. And so I started doing that, and that's continued now 25 years later, still working on these issues.
Incredible. I love studying you guys, the researchers, because it's just fascinating to me how you get to that point, and what forms those ideas or that goal of here's where I want to put my life and invest my time. And I'm just so thankful for that because it's absolutely fascinating to me. Let's provide our audience with kind of a working definition of extremist groups, if we could. Not just what they are, but how they kind of operate and recruit, especially in today's digital age. I know that's a big question, but just kind of give us a picture so we're all on the same page.
Sure, sure. I'll try to do that. Now, it's easier said than done because, as it turns out, defining extremism is quite complicated, and it's perplexed scholars and practitioners and
Hmm.
policymakers for quite some time as far as where to draw the lines between what's extreme and what's not extreme.
Right.
Now, having said that, it's even more complicated today than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago. Because one of the things we've seen happen is extremism has become normalized and mainstreamed in many respects.
Hmm.
And so I'll come back to that in a moment. But let me just say that even saying that, there certainly, I think, are some things we can point to that I think most people would agree with are indicators of extremism. So, for example, the issue of violence is an important one. Promoting or engaging in violence for some kind of political purpose is a kind of hallmark of extremism, is something that separates having, more ordinary political views versus more extreme political views would be the issue of violence. I think it's really important when we think about extremism to first, though, start with the premise that we should be careful about making judgments of what's extreme and what's not based on things like ethnicity, religion. In other words, we want to be careful not to create profiles that really can be quite biased and unfair and lead to really serious consequences. Rather than doing that, what we should be much more focused on are behaviors and practices. And so that's where violence would be an important behavior that we would look at. Ideas or beliefs. And so people who may not be actually engaged in violence can still be supporting and promoting violence through their
Yeah.
beliefs and their expression of their beliefs. So that would be another aspect. And then emotions
Right.
are really critical, sometimes overlooked. A big part of what constitutes extremism is about how we feel. It's our emotions, anger, frustration. A really quite wide array of emotions are kind of entangled with what constitutes extremism. So those
Gotcha.
are, I think, some indicators. Another
Yeah.
thing we can point to would be certain kinds of ideologies that are exclusionary. That
Mm.
is, they separate us, the in group, from the out group, but not in a more, you say, normal fashion. So, in other words, humans have a tendency, it's hardwired in, it seems to be, it's part of kind of our long history, it's part of our evolutionary makeup, it appears, it's widely practiced across cultures, which is to make distinctions between us and them, to have insiders and outsiders.
Gotcha.
But when that becomes so distinctive that you're excluding the them from enjoying certain rights, segregating them, forcing them to live in certain areas, not allowing them certain rights of citizenship like voting,
Hmm.
obviously engaging in violence to those that are perceived as outsiders. That would be a hallmark of extremism, which is quite different from making certain more normative distinctions between, part of my group, we share certain traditions, we maybe share a religion, we share certain
Hmm.
customs, and these are people I identify with. And there are others who don't fall into that group and that they have, there's differences based on those things that I just mentioned. Making
Right.
those kind of distinctions isn't necessarily a bad thing. But when it is then coupled with these kinds of things like exclusion, extreme exclusion, violence, and so forth, now we seem to cross over into what we think we can call extremism.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that kind of totality of the circumstances. Totally get
Exactly.
that. So let's dive for a minute into domestic
Okay.
extremist
Yeah.
groups. Just kind of give us an idea of those groups. There's obviously going to be an extremist that I assume can be a solo actor, right? But let's
Mhm.
kind of focus on the group side of it. What are some of the more prominent ones out there in America today?
Sure. Well, we could look at, for instance, the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. All
Hmm.
right. Three groups in particular. Many groups were involved, and many individuals who weren't affiliated with any groups,
Right.
even more so, were involved. But there were three main players that helped organize aspects of the attack on the Capitol and then carry it out. And that was the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and the Three Percenters.
Mm. Okay.
And these are groups that, in the case of the Oath Keepers and Three Percenters, come on the scene around 2008, 2009 timeframe.
Hmm.
This would have been after Barack Obama, our first black president's election, and it would have been part of what we call the second wave of the anti-government militia movement. The first wave being in the 1990s, which kind of culminates with the Oklahoma
Right.
City bombing that we just discussed.
Yep.
Second wave is really a reaction to the election of Barack Obama and a feeling that our rights are being taken from us. Obama's not truly an American. He's wasn't born in the United States. They faked the birth certificate, that he's going to take away our gun rights and so forth and so on.
Right.
And the
Okay.
two groups in particular that kind of come to exemplify or represent that second wave of the militia movement were the Oath Keepers and Three Percenters. And so, in terms of the Three Percenters, they kind of have been more of a decentralized, almost like a concept, really. There's
Hmm.
this idea of Three Percenter, which erroneously refers to the idea that there were only 3% of the colonists who basically fought against the British in the Revolutionary War. It's the
Hmm.
idea that there's this vanguard of people who are going to be the folks who fight against the tyranny, and they believe now the federal government has become tyrannical and that needs to be fought against in a way similar to the way the British were fought against.
Hmm.
And so in that time frame, the 2008 time frame, they believed that Obama, at the head of the state and the federal government more broadly, was this kind of force of tyranny that needed to be resisted. And you find different kind of three percenter groups crop up across the country. And of course, ultimately, in some cases, they actually form terror cells and plan terror attacks. Most of the time, they've fortunately been prevented from carrying out those attacks.
Hmm.
That did not happen with January 6th. And of course, the attack was carried out, and we saw a lot of violence that day. And January 6th is an interesting case because it represents some of the complexities that we were talking about earlier about where extremism begins and ends.
Right.
In part because, in that case, you had the President of the United States who was helping incite the violence, who was helping promote the idea of coming to DC and that there would be violence, who had told the Proud Boys to stand back, stand by during a presidential debate, who had tweeted things that were pretty insightful, and then on the day of January 6th, makes a speech that's quite insightful. And so that really does kind of underscore where things are at now in terms of, how do you define what's extreme and what's not when you have, powerful political leaders who are essentially encouraging, in some cases, and promoting political violence. And of course, with Donald Trump, that was the case going back to his first run for president beginning back in 2015 and really pretty clear pattern there. So I would say, going back to the groups though, you have three percenters, the Oath Keepers that were important in January 6th attack, the Proud Boys, which are a more recent group. They come on the scene around 2016 and really very clearly associated with violence, a lot of street violence in particular, where they're brawling with various folks, including Antifa, that they have a strong hostility towards. anti-BLM as well, and some incidents of them targeting BLM and even a black church in DC that they targeted at one point prior to January 6th. So those are three kind of prominent groups. But then, of course, we have much older examples that go back to early parts of our country's history, like the Ku Klux Klan, for example, founded shortly after the U.S. Civil War, still around today in various forms. And there's lots of groups that are essentially the Ku Klux Klan by another name. So, you have a whole hodgepodge of different folks out there. And of course, groups, these anti-government and white supremacist type groups aren't the only types of extremist groups. And you have groups, on the left as well that represent different types of political extremism. You have groups that are more kind of religiously oriented, obviously Islamic extremist groups that have been involved in various forms of political violence. So, it is quite a hodgepodge of different ideologies and groups that are out there.
That's for sure. Yeah, let's focus for a minute on the white supremacy side of things here because you did incredible research on that. Can you kind of give us a rundown on that research and we'll just kind of go from there?
Sure. So back in 97, I started first by looking at websites that were kind of all over the place by then. You could just do it easy. Wasn't Google because there wasn't Google, but keyword searches on the search engines and find, hundreds, thousands of these kind of websites. And so that was kind of my first effort to get a sense of the landscape. What do these groups believe? How are they kind of organized, at least as they are represented on these websites? And then from there, I started making contact with actual groups and seeing if they would allow me to spend time with them. I was able to do that and actually kind of embedded myself with some folks in southern Utah and northern Arizona. And then from there, I made contact with folks up in northern Idaho, which at that time, Aryan Nations had a compound up in Hayden Lake, Idaho. They had 20 acres in beautiful, pristine northern Idaho, out in the forest on the lakes out up there. It's gorgeous country, but unfortunately, it's also attracted a fair number of these types of folks. And Aryan Nations was there, and I started going up there in '97 and attending. They would have these annual conferences, basically. They called them congresses, and they would do cross burnings and swastika burnings, and they had a church on their property where they would hold church services and sermons and so forth, and they would have weddings sometimes, and they allowed me to come, and basically their only stipulation was that I'd be white, and they said as long as you're white you're more than welcome to come up and visit. So I started doing that and was able to attend a number of those and meet folks from all over the country and even actually from other countries. They would have these events where folks from different European countries would come out as well. And they had speakers and would do barbecuing and all that kind of stuff to make it almost like a festival atmosphere, but
Yeah.
focused on, neo-Nazism, white supremacy, Christian identity. They were had essentially a white supremacist interpretation of the Bible, so they did have a very strong religious kind of component to their group as well. And the meetings did have a lot of prayer and a lot of reading from scripture and so forth. So that was a big part of their kind of culture. And then from there, I met folks from Southern California, and they introduced me to some folks down there, and I was able to do quite a bit of field work where I now live in Orange County in Southern California, which has a long, long history of these types of groups, and is one of the probably hot spots in the United States is actually in Southern California, has been for quite some time.
Interesting. Okay, we can do a whole nother podcast on this because I am fascinated. Like I said when we began here, I'm fascinated by researchers, but researchers that go out in the field, it's just like Indiana Jones. I mean, I'm just fascinated by this. So I want to go down that path for just a minute. I promise we'll just spend a minute on it and then we'll get back to this. But tell me your interaction there. Did you say, hey, I'm a researcher. I'm ultimately going to be potentially writing books on this. I'm, a professor. Like, kind of give me just a picture of what it was like with your interaction with them and how they accepted you.
Yeah, when you do this kind of field work, there's a whole range of options in terms of methodological choices to make about the roles you play and how you represent yourself. And you can go from all the way to what's called covert research,
Hmm.
where you don't present yourself as a researcher, you present yourself as one of them.
Right.
Basically. And that's called covert research. And then at the other end is where you're very overt about being a researcher. It's almost like you walk around with a badge that says you're a researcher.
Right.
So that would be the other kind of extreme end of the continuum. I was somewhere in the middle to the covert side of things. I never lied to people. And of course, when
Okay.
I first started, I was a student, so I played
Oh,
up the
right.
student role because that seems less threatening than a
Yep.
professor. And I really played up the idea, and it's true, that I wanted to learn. I was trying to learn about this world, and so that was I really tried to make a point of not being non-judgmental, right? That
Right.
I'm not here to judge, and that was true too. That wasn't my role to judge. Obviously, I don't hold these beliefs, and I don't have these
Right.
feelings, and I don't identify with their world, but I wanted to understand it. So being non-judgmental is, absolutely critical if you're going to try and understand something.
Yeah.
Where it got tricky though is people would assume that you were one of them. And
Mhm.
so that would happen is that, my skin color and I'm present at these events, then the assumption is, oh, you must be one of us. And so sometimes the lines would get pretty blurry and I would have to try and clarify things. Sometimes people who knew I was a researcher that I was really spending a lot of time with, they would allow me to, stay in their homes. Sometimes they had a spare bedroom that they would allow me to stay in. And in those cases, it got real, even though they knew I was a researcher. Anytime I was going to spend a lot of time with folks, I was real clear about who I was. If I
Right.
was just meeting somebody in passing, then I didn't necessarily mention that I was doing research,
Yeah.
although at some point I might, depending on how the conversation went. But folks I was spending a lot of time with certainly knew that I was a researcher, and still it would get confusing. They would kind of forget in a way and start to think that I was kind of with them. And
Right.
of course, that's, indicative of the fact that, when you're a part of these kind of worlds, these extremist worlds, you want to believe that everybody
Mhm.
else can see the light. If they
Right.
just get exposed to the right information, they can come to see things the way that they see things. And of course, they believe they have the truth. They believe they have this special insight about how the world operates. And they do typically, not always, but typically want to share that with others, and especially somebody who maybe they've developed a relationship with on some level. It becomes even more, I think, they become to feel that they want to, kind of bring that person into the fold, even, and they're more motivated to do that, I think.
Right.
So it did get complicated at times in terms of trying to define the role that I was, playing.
Right. Oh, I can only imagine. So now, kind of taking that and putting it in terms of you were embedded, but you were not a believer. You're outside of it now for many, many years and whatnot. What kind of things can people do to disengage from these groups? Because you have the inside knowledge of how it works, the operations, what the beliefs are, what the indoctrination looks like. And now there's certainly people that want out, there's people that have got out. What kind of things can people do to disengage from this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something we were very interested in. Starting back in 2012, we started interviewing people who had left, and so now we've interviewed hundreds of folks who have left these types of groups and types of movements, and really trying to learn from their experiences in many respects. And we do these really intensive, what we call life history interviews with these
Mhm.
folks. We start with their earliest memories from childhood and then move to the present, basically,
Gotcha.
including how they ultimately got involved and then ultimately how they ended up leaving. And I should say that folks who leave, it's not a one size fits all. They
Mhm.
leave for lots of different reasons and they leave in lots of different ways. It's not the departure process isn't the same for everyone. It can look very differently. For some people, it's more of like a fading away. They kind of retire.
Mm.
And for others, it's a real hard break that sometimes even involves them getting death threats and so forth. So it can look very differently. And one of the things we're finding with that disengagement process is that even when you leave, that's not the end of the story in terms of being done with it.
Mm.
And one of the things we find, you had mentioned addiction at the beginning, is that there's a lot of residual that people experience after they leave. Things hang over.
Yeah.
There's things that people have a really hard time getting rid of, some of the feelings and some of the beliefs that get really deeply ingrained. And they continue to experience those feelings and beliefs, sometimes in a very involuntary fashion, where they actually describe that, I don't want to believe these things anymore. I don't want to feel this way anymore, but I can't get rid of it. The hate won't go away. It just keeps coming back. And of course, they maybe experience certain triggers, like certain stressful situations where it really comes up. But, one of the things we find is that people need time.
Yeah.
And that's may sound obvious, but this is not an overnight process. Really, it's a process that takes time to work through in terms of disengagement.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of what people describe as being helpful is relationships with individuals who are willing to give them that time to process and help them process in a
Gotcha.
non-adversarial way. Now, obviously, forming those relationships can be, complicated, and how we go about promoting those kind of relationships is
Yeah.
easier said than done. But certainly, individuals who lack support, who are trying to do this on their own, have a much harder time than folks who have some kind of support system that can help them work through it. So that makes a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. What was your disengagement from this? And again, we want to make it perfectly clear. You weren't a believer, you weren't a participant, you were a researcher there, but at different levels, like you said. In some cases, very overt of, yeah, I'm researching, et cetera, and some probably a little bit less obvious. Any interesting things as you disengaged from each of these groups? Were they like, hey, great to have you here, see you later? Or was there any type of pushback of, why are you leaving, or anything like that?
Well, it did vary. Some of the work I was doing up in Aryan Nations, Idaho, was easy to kind of come and go, and it wasn't a kind of big deal. There was a group in Southern California that I'd been spending a lot of time with, and this was summer of 2004. I was actually living with a family. They had a spare bedroom they put me up in, and they were introducing me to all their friends. They were part of a pretty broad, wide, far-reaching network of folks of, similar beliefs.
Yeah, okay.
So they were introducing me to people, and apparently I said the wrong thing to the wrong person, and they got the idea in their head that I was an FBI, an undercover FBI agent. So the guy I was staying with, he pulled me aside at one point and said, "Hey, this is what's going on. They think you're working for the feds. They're planning on stabbing you the next time they see you," which would have been the end of the week. And he said, I think we can work things out though, and we could clarify the confusion. Of course, I didn't think that was such a great idea, so I hightailed it out of there and left California, went back to, I was working at the University of Nebraska at the time. So that disengagement was a little bit abrupt. And I
Yeah,
started getting emails after that from somebody who claimed to be Dr. Mengele, the Nazi Germany, Dr.
yeah.
Mengele. And they were sending me emails, basically some fairly thinly veiled threats of various sorts. And that went on for a while, and I guess eventually they got bored, so it stopped. Fortunately, nothing ever came of that, but it was a little bit stressful there for a while.
I could imagine. Wow, the life of a researcher in the field. Fascinating. So let's talk about your research, where you've studied threats against public officials across sectors like healthcare, education, law enforcement. What warning signs should organizational leaders be watching for when employees may be radicalizing or even posing an insider threat?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, one of the tricky things about radicalization is that most indicators of radicalization are perfectly legal.
True.
So, there's a real constitutional issue when it comes to how we make these assessments and what we're
Mhm.
monitoring. And of course, if you only monitor things that are against the law, well, then you already have your issues that you can act on. So if you're waiting for people to break the law, then it's kind of, late in the game to be then.
That's right.
But on the other hand, we have to be careful not to violate people's constitutional protections and punish people for having beliefs that might not be popular or so
Right.
forth. And certainly, one of the tricky things about threats to public officials is there's some very kind of ambiguous lines, and this kind of built into the statute. I mean,
Hmm.
if you say I'm going to put a bullet in such and such congressperson's head, well, you've pretty clearly violated
Hmm.
the law, and can be potentially arrested and charged. But if it's a little more ambiguous what you're saying, then you may not have crossed the legal threshold for having made a criminal threat. You might have made a threat, but it might not be a criminal threat. And I think that's kind of an interesting distinction, is that there are threats and then there are criminal threats. And depending on how specific and whether there's time and place in terms of what you've communicated, that all makes a difference, and whether there's any indications that you plan to carry out the act is also part of it. And that gets to that radicalization part. Unfortunately, we live in a country right now where a lot of people are saying things they shouldn't say.
Hmm.
And there's almost an encouragement to be kind of a troll of sorts, and to engage in this kind of toxic banter. Social media in many respects, I think, promotes this kind of toxic communication. And so this is kind of built into our climate right now. And it makes assessing these issues that much more complicated. What are the false positives? What are the false negatives?
Yeah.
And, it's very difficult to suss those things out. So, the clear indicators are obvious when people are talking about, wanting to obtain plans for how to make a bomb.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, obviously that's something you want to take very seriously, and
Right.
would want to further monitor and investigate that, and identify, notify authorities and so forth.
Right.
But it's the more subtle stuff where it's like, do you take action or not? And I don't think there are any easy answers there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because they all do come in every form, shape, size. And again, going back to my comment from earlier, it's really kind of that totality of all that information that all of a sudden begins to put off the warning signs. Not necessarily, red lights and sirens at that point, but it's enough that maybe we need to look into this more. We may need to talk about it more, or whatever your organization's best path forward is to address that. I want to go back for a minute here about our comments about addiction, and how this hate can certainly be this psychologically addictive thing. How does this addiction model help us understand why traditional de-escalation might not work with extremist influenced type of people?
Well, yeah, and I want to be careful, that it's not, to the extent that there are addictive qualities here.
Okay.
Um, is it exactly the same as heroin addiction? That's certainly not what we're saying.
Right.
So just want, addiction is one of those terms that I think it's used in lots of different ways, and
Hmm.
sometimes the meaning of addiction can be watered down pretty substantial, or at least kind of unclear.
Yeah.
And we were trying to raise this point about there being some, in part because the individuals themselves are describing
Hmm.
what would be consistent with the definition of addiction, as has been laid out by psychologists and other and scientists who study addiction.
Yeah.
But what we think is important about this, probably more than anything, is it's fairly straightforward in many respects, is that when we're talking about a person who's come to immerse their life in this kind of world, and adhering to these kind of beliefs and the emotional aspects and the practices, it really does become totalizing in terms of their identity in many respects,
Hmm.
and all encompassing in many respects. And moving away from that is it's not simply about, I don't believe these things anymore. It goes much deeper than that. We are, I think, oftentimes talking about very deeply entrenched issues that we shouldn't expect to be we should be able to address in a fairly straightforward manner, because I don't
Hmm.
think that's realistic. When you're dealing with these kind of deeply entrenched issues, you're going to oftentimes have a person who's going to slide back and forth for at least a period of time. It's going to vary a lot with the person, but also things can get transferred quite easily. So a person may not have the beliefs anymore. Let's just say a person who'd been involved in a white supremacist group.
Hmm.
They don't have those beliefs anymore, but the emotional underpinning that's part of their involvement is still with them. And
Hmm.
so now, while they're not engaged in white supremacist activities, they may be engaged in other antisocial activities. They may be
Right.
very manipulative in their dealings with other people. They may have this kind of an emotional callousness that characterizes how they look at other individuals,
Hmm.
and so that may then be linked to other types of antisocial behavior unrelated to the white supremacist stuff,
Hmm.
but very much related to this common emotional kind of core that came to characterize how they see the world while they were a white supremacist that hasn't really changed since they left. And
Right.
so, yeah, that's a very deep thing. And how do you unravel that and
Yeah.
really try and help a person not just not be a white supremacist anymore, but really change something in a way that's at a deeper level.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine for some of these individuals, this is all encompassing for a portion of their life, maybe even a huge portion of their life, right? Where everyone that surrounds them, every conversation is geared towards this. And then I guess there's others that are probably a little more on the peripheral, where like, hey, I go to a meeting once a week, or I have a family member who talks about this stuff and I kind of get it or don't, whatever. I think that's part of it is it's just so all encompassing. How do you kind of peel that away? And there is no instant fix for those individuals because that's all they've known. I mean, they've probably forgotten the other side of that story that maybe they had in the first part of their life or when they were younger, and now it's transitioned
Well,
into that.
yeah, and I think you're pointing to the importance of doing assessment to figure out kind of where people fall in that continuum in terms of are they deeply entrenched or more on the periphery, because we're going to have a different kind of response depending on that assessment. And I think you're also pointing to the importance of preventative measures. We want to keep people, we want to intervene before people get deeply entrenched.
Yeah.
We want to try and suss out, especially for young people who are starting to dabble with this. Maybe they're getting some exposure through, different digital platforms they may be involved in. It's much more effective and much better for the child, for the family, for the community, for society as a whole if we can intervene earlier and really kind of offset that process of a person becoming more immersed and more deeply entrenched in it.
Hmm.
Because it's always going to be more difficult and less, much greater likelihood of failure in terms of our response
Yeah.
if we're dealing with somebody who's, more deeply entrenched versus somebody who's kind of much more early stages.
Right. Absolutely. Hey, so you opened up a can of worms. You said the word digital. Let's talk for just a minute social media. I mean, because that certainly has had an influence, obviously, from back at the time you researched it to today, or even prior to that. It kind of give us just the lay of the land on that, how that has kind of changed maybe the recruitment side of it through social media or other digital interfaces as well. Just kind of your take on how that is influencing it today.
Yeah, having seen this and watched this kind of evolve from, 96 to the present, it's been extraordinary, really, to see the websites get now you've got these platforms that allow real-time communication, sharing of very graphic images and videos that are promoting political violence, depicting really horrific stuff, in some cases, graphic violence, murder, gore scenes, sexual assault, and can do so in fairly semi-encrypted or even fully encrypted fashion. So there's a lot of privacy and security involved that allows for people to share ideas about how to commit terror attacks and make explosives and so forth. And then you have the platforms where that's happening, but you also have these more mainstream platforms
Mhm.
like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and X and where it's also very present. You've got neo-Nazis on X as we speak, promoting their cause. This is happening across the mainstream platforms that, where you literally people have access to potentially millions and millions of people to get the message out to now, so that the accessibility to large numbers of people is so much greater now than it was, prior to social media. Certainly, the easy access to the material, well, just a couple clicks, that's been, I think, really beneficial to extremists to have the opportunity to get the message out to large numbers in relatively easy fashion. And again, we talked early on at the beginning about the normalization, and I think, you've got a few different key factors that have led to the normalization of extremism. And social media is certainly at the top of the list there for factors that have helped normalize this kind of the beliefs, the emotions, and the practices that we think constitute extremism. Social media has been a huge vehicle, an opportunity to circulate those practices and ideas and emotions in such a wide fashion. And again, not surprising, also, it's tied up with our national political leadership and the promotion of political violence that we see from national political figures who use social media to help do that in part. So, yeah, it's been very, very critical for what we've seen in terms of the extremist landscape.
Absolutely. And I think you see it too. There's those groups that have kind of met this challenge of the digital age and those that are, we'll just say, for lack of a better term, maybe more old school. I mean, we see it certainly in terrorist groups, right? Where some have absolutely gone all out on their media side of things, social media, their digital interface, their websites, everything else. I assume it's kind of the same in these domestic extremist groups where you have some that are still old school. It's, come to the prayer meeting or whatever they want to call it, and that's how we kind of indoctrinate you because we gave you a flyer. And then there's those that are just really into the digital world with those posts on social media, but also I would assume websites as well, right? That are just truly recruiting and sharing their information.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about the far right in the United States is how they were really at the forefront of seeing this technology and the potential it offered. And we can go back to the 1980s with electronic bulletin boards,
Right.
kind of pre-internet days, and you had key figures that were leaders within the white supremacist movement who said this technology is essential for us to be able to harness,
Yeah.
and we can really use this to our advantage. And then fast forward a decade to the mid 90s, and you had, the Stormfront web forum, which comes online around 95,
Right.
96, becomes the largest white supremacist web forum in the world at one time. And again, the idea was we can get the message out through the internet, and we can start to shape the narrative, and we can use our own language to describe ourselves and our beliefs in a way that will be more palpable. So we're not going to call ourselves white supremacists. We're not going to call ourselves neo-Nazis. We're going to call ourselves white nationalists because that sounds less threatening. And you saw Stormfront did that on their web forum. This is, like I said, 95, 96. And now, the term white nationalism is ubiquitous, and we see it bandied about regularly. And in fact, media outlets have to be careful about using the term white supremacist and neo-Nazi for fear of being sued. So the amount of influence they've had on shaping the narrative is really quite extraordinary. They were talking, in the 90s and 80s about immigration being an invasion, right? The idea that immigration is an invasion, that was the term of that they wanted to use. They believed that could really shape perceptions. Now, who do we hear talking about immigration being an invasion? We hear it coming from the White House. We hear it coming from Congress.
Mhm.
So white supremacists have shaped the narrative in such a way that it's become normalized, and the highest institutions of power are using their framing for issues like this.
That is so fascinating. Yeah, it's amazing how they have kind of met this challenge. And I'm not saying that as a positive, but it's a
Right.
factual example of what
Actualization.
they've done.
Yeah.
So, if I understand right, you have done or you're doing some research on family members of extremists and their role kind of in suspicious activity reporting. What can organizations learn from families about recognizing those concerning behavioral changes?
Yeah, really important issue. And of course, families are really the front line. So if we want to have the most effective strategies when it comes to prevention and intervention and law enforcement detection, we really have to do everything possible to help support families. And it's a really tough position to be in if you have a member of your family who starts to radicalize. What do you do? First of all, how do you spot it? Because most family members have not been studying radicalization process for decades. They haven't been reading academic articles about the indicators or practitioner articles about the indicators for assessing threat and so forth.
Yeah,
They've been leading their lives and trying to raise their family the best they can. And then there's a situation emerges where one of their loved ones starts to go down this path. And A, being able to spot it, not necessarily easy. And B, what do I do once I spot it? Where do I go? Who do I
yeah,
turn to? Do I call the FBI? I mean, obviously
yeah,
in some situations, family members don't have much other choice other than doing that if it's that, serious. But
right,
um, other than that, though, I don't think, most family members want to pick up the phone and call the FBI
right.
when they're concerned about a relative. That's certainly not going to be my go-to. So ideally, we would have lots of community services and supports available for families to help them make these determinations and to provide them resources. Unfortunately, we don't invest in those kind of things very well in this country, and we've got a real lack of supports in place and resources in place for families. Um, One of the things families tell us is that in hindsight, things became much more obvious,
Hmm.
but that at the time, the warning signs that later on were obvious weren't so obvious. So some of this stuff is just really hard when you're in real time to say, okay, it's like, family members would see something that maybe their child says something that's a little bit out of character, is talking about
Right.
maybe some type of conspiracy theory, and they notice it, but they don't really know what to make of it,
Yeah.
and so families that are able to respond, I mean, obviously one of the things is communication is
Mhm.
critical, and having open dialogue, especially with, young kids as they're growing up and starting to explore different things, being aware of what they're doing
Right.
online, very critical. Many parents who weren't able to detect, will describe not being very aware of what their child was involved in
Mm.
online in terms of digital platforms and
Yeah.
how long they were using it, how much they were using them. So sometimes it's a lack of communication and a lack of information that really prevents families from being able to make these kind of assessments and determinations. But also, it is something that's very difficult to do in real time. And I
Yeah.
don't think we want to try and develop the resources and help families. We also don't want to suggest that this is easier than it really is,
Yeah.
or less complicated than it really is, because sometimes you look at practitioners and scholars will study a case after, the worst outcome occurs, let's say a
Yeah.
terror attack. And even with that ability of hindsight, it can be very difficult to figure out where did things go wrong in this person's life. When did things start really kind of moving in the direction of them embracing this kind of radical approach and ultimately, endorsing violence and then engaging in violence. It's oftentimes, even in retrospect, not that clear. Families don't have that benefit. They're dealing with it in real time, and very, very tough situation to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see how it can be that kind of slow boil, because there's those things that maybe happen early on where you want to discount it as a family member.
Yep.
You don't want to believe your loved one is on a pathway to anything like this, so you discount it. Oh, they're having a bad day. They said something negative about someone, and it's that slow boil that before you know it, now it's front and center and now you got to do something about it. So it's fascinating. Hey, we're just about out of time here, but I want to just end with one question, and I hope you'll come back because there's so much more to talk about, and I want to in the future dive really into a lot more what you did as the embedded researcher because that is just fascinating to me. So I know it's fascinating to others. undoubtedly. But let's talk for just a minute to wrap this up. As when you testified as the expert witness in a high-profile case such as the Portland Max train attack. If our audience isn't familiar with it, you can Google it. There's plenty of information out there about it. But what's the difference, kind of, between that concerning speech and legally actionable threats in the workplace? Where's kind of that line drawn?
Well, when you're talking about calls for violence, promoting violence, um, it can be legally protected still because, we do have a pretty high threshold, the Brandenburg decision, Supreme Court decision about free speech and where the line crosses. It is quite a high threshold.
Yeah.
But, employers they don't have to wait until the person's speech, moves into the direction of something, an actual criminal offense.
Right.
A person who's engaging in even violent talk that's maybe not, a criminal threat of any kind, but still is concerning, employers can look at that and certainly can be cause for investigation and monitoring, the discussions to be had, maybe bringing in some additional help, consultants, mental health, social work folks, getting additional eyes on it, I think is really critical when you see certainly any reference to violence. But, oftentimes there won't be a direct reference to violence. That doesn't mean it's not concerning. People's, a lot of extremist propaganda is coded.
Mm.
And you talk about a conspiracy theory that somebody's promoting. It may not specifically involve a call to violence, but
Right.
it does potentially indirectly. So, for instance, the QAnon conspiracy about there being all these sex rings that are
Mm.
drinking the blood of children and doing all, and the Democrats are leading this pedophile ring and so forth. If somebody were to be espousing those in the workplace, that it's not a direct call for violence, certainly, but in a way, it could technically be indirectly a call for violence, depending on what they're suggesting.
Mhm.
Certainly, it's reason for concern. So even conspiracy theories and other aspects of extremist propaganda, if folks are kind of expressing those things, I think those are also reason for concern and can be used as kind of the threshold to have additional, investigation and monitoring and discussions.
Mhm.
Again, not necessarily any of those things are against the law, though.
Right. Absolute incredible insight, Dr. Pete. I so appreciate the time you spent with us today. And I want everyone to check out his books. We'll also have them in the show notes so you don't have to take note right now. But his book, American Swastika Inside the White Power Movement's Hidden Spaces of Hate, and Out of Hiding, Extremist White Supremacy and How It Can Be Stopped. You need to check out these books. Great information there. It just adds all the more to what we just discussed. Pete, thank you for being here. So much appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure talking with you today.
Well, it was great having you. And again, thanks again to all of you for joining us on another episode of Are We Good? Please remember Belanti.net for all of your workplace violence prevention needs, or even just to collaborate on a need that you have for your organization. Check us out at Belanti.net. We very much appreciate everyone hitting that subscribe button on YouTube. That's what propels us and helps us in building our audience. A like, a share, or a repost is also great. Very much appreciate it. We love to hear your feedback, and thank you very much for listening. And as always, don't forget to ask that question before disaster strikes. Are we good?